So we're going to get the conclusions from Hugues Dumont, and first we would like to thank him very much because he accepted that something I would not have accepted personally, maybe many others, that is to accept without notice to draw the conclusions of these 2 days. So he teaches constitutional law at the Louvain University. He was the vice-rector and he was the founding father of his research center, the Research Center of Administrative and Constitutional Affairs. And he's got a long bibliography in theory of law, theory of the state, institutional law, and institutional law of the EU. That's his specialty. So thank you very much. When I joined this conference, someone told me that the program was very interesting, but the regret was that Hugues Dumont would not do the conclusions. Because it became rare that Hugues Dumont did not do the conclusions. So thanks to someone missing, we'll hear his conclusions. Thank you, Matthias. Well, it's true that I didn't sleep very well because I was asked to replace another speaker to do the conclusions. So please forgive me for the improvised conclusions that I put together, but I'm going to deliver them to your attention because there won't be any further questions, but you could, of course, ask questions during the drink afterwards. So I would like to organize these conclusions because my ambition is to offer a certain number of transversal thoughts, taking into account as much as I could most of the speeches that we've heard over the past 2 days. And of course, I'm not going to quote all speakers, so I apologize in advance for those that I will not mention, but I try to cover as much as I could everyone. 6 things. First thing, the definition of trust, the unavoidable definition of trust. Some young person has a passion for analytical philosophy. Maybe we should ask him to help us develop some concepts that are quite close from one another: legitimacy, democracy, and so on. Second thing, of course, I will highlight the social and political dimension of this concept, and we have the pleasure of having taken part in an interdisciplinary conference, giving the floor to famous legal experts and other experts. So I will tackle that sphere, and then I will recall the relationship aspect and the multidimensional aspect of this concept of trust. Fourth point, very briefly, I will highlight the paradoxical nature, deeply paradoxical nature of this concept, trust and distrust being totally connected. And it's only in my fifth point that I will mention the legal aspect of trust. And sixth point that will deal with the optimal level at which we need to explain the rules of this trust and what is in favor of building trust. So that's my outline. So first thing, defining trust. Well, there are several definitions. I do agree, but I was quite attracted to the proposal by Céline and Lena at the very beginning of the conference. So to refresh your memory, because this is a definition that obviously these two ladies have thought deeply. There are hours and hours of work, so each word matters. So if I took good notes, cognitive and motivational state, a mix of rationals and feelings from the truster that engages in a social relationship with others, the trustees. whether it is people or institutions, and this based on the hope that this person or institution will realize the expectations, given that this person has a certain degree of freedom to achieve the expectations of the truster. So here we have an attempt of a transdisciplinary definition, but at the very beginning there's a proposal of definition which is transdisciplinary. So this is quite bold, something transdisciplinary is always very difficult. So I would like to thank Céline and Lena to offer this definition. So it's an expectation that different actors might have towards the behavior of other actors based on the partial information they have and that they consider sufficient. And this relationship is necessarily tainted with vulnerability. The one who places trust in another person or in an institution is vulnerable and likely to be disappointed not to see his expectations becoming a reality. Second point. It is a concept which has some relevance on the social and political level in political sciences. And here I would like to refer to the excellent presentation by Jean-Benoît Pillet, who told us this morning a minimum of political trust is indispensable as the basis of the political system. And this minimum of political trust is theorized in David Easton's approach, so a functionalist approach. That's the diffuse support, abstract support, which is built. He insisted a lot on this diachronic approach. It's built on the long term. And I would like to add reference to Nelly Demireva's contribution. She told us about societies with ethnic divisions. I think that trust refers to a minimum of political support in a political system and in a society that is at least a little bit inclusive. There are some discriminations that make trust impossible on behalf of minorities. A question that Jean-Benoît Pillet does not ask: what kind of political systems are we talking about? Is it a national political system? Many studies on trust have the prerequisite of a national political system. So for us in Belgium, we live in a federal state that doesn't call itself multinational, but which is multinational. So we always have this question in mind. But fortunately, we tackle the notion of trust in non-national political systems, and that's what's interesting in Patricia Popolier's presentation. She tackled the notion of trust at the level for federal systems, and she included in her construction of federal political systems the EU, which has caught our attention with Mrs. Riscala and myself. So the social structures determine political structures, and she insisted a lot on the importance of trust between political elites in federal systems at several levels. And I think that this is absolutely true, whether it is for the EU or for Belgium. I have understood that Céline and Lena are considering in their table of the different circles of trust at the most ultimate level. Well, they're wondering whether this minimum support, this minimum trust does require some form of belonging to a nation, some kind of national identity or not. Of course, that makes impossible the trust in the EU and also the trust in a state like Belgium. So I don't think that the feeling of belonging is essential to support trust in a nation, but we could debate on that. But a certain federal loyalty is indispensable. So I was a bit surprised. I don't know if Patricia is still here. Patricia Popelier told us that the federal loyalty, responding to a question this morning, that does not involve a trust relationship, but it involves some cooperation obligations. Yes, but I think that we cooperate better when we are loyal. The partners of forced cooperation sometimes because of the case law of the Constitutional Court, for example. I think that the partners work better in a cooperative federalism when they have this minimum of trust relationship and trust between the political elites that Patricia Popelier insisted on. But I'm coming back to the very interesting presentation of Jean-Benoît Pillet, but I think that there was the assumption of a national trust, and I remind you what he taught us. And legal experts have to be quite humble, because we could guess that trust is not something you decide, and it's politologists who are equipped to assess the factors that determine de facto trust. And he was very clear: the representative institutions have little influence on the generation of trust. It's especially the content of the decision. So in fact, the performances of our elected representatives in governments that weigh the most in trust. So it's the content of decisions that is more important than the decision mode that matters. It's always hard to hear, but we have to hear us. Representative institutions generate the least trust, and they're not the ones generating the most trust. But then he's sending us on to the idea, and Céline and Lina had considered that yesterday, that participatory democracy, if it's designed well, is vector of trust. And so the two formulas that seem to be the most appreciated through sociological investigations or surveys is that elected representatives decide, but based on the work of experts upstream, or a second formula that seems to get the support of the respondents. A parliamentary debate takes place. All the arguments for or against a proposal are provided, and then there is a referendum afterwards to decide on this proposal. I find this very interesting because it seems paradoxical with what was said just before that, is that the representative institutions are not the ones generating the most trust. So it means that representative institutions are credited with a certain trust relationship if the work of representatory democracy is articulated with participatory mechanisms, and especially the referendum or citizen commissions chosen randomly. So I thought that was very exciting, and this is why I wanted to refresh your memory if you had forgotten about this. So this is what I will limit myself to for my second point. So trust as a social and political concept. Third point, this is mainly a relational concept and multidimensional concept with a vertical and horizontal dimension, but each of these dimensions is a tenfold. So there's a relationship between the citizen and the political system as a whole, between the citizen and an institution. And Émilie Van Oort said we should not overgeneralize the institutions. Each institution has its specialty. The citizen might have some expectations. And of course, there is a trust relationship that we have or not towards the members of those institutions. I can trust the parliament, but the question is, do I trust this MP or that minister? And this vertical trust, well, we tend to tackle it in a bottom-up approach from the citizen to the political systems, institutions, or institution members. But there are several speakers, Émilie Van Oort, Jean-François Kerléo, have insisted on the importance of a trust relationship fed by the institutions themselves towards the citizens. And there is often here a deficit to a certain extent. In a certain number of cases, we have to see that there is some distrust of the governments towards the citizens, which of course is detrimental to participatory democracies. And then there is the horizontal democracy, and this is the relationship of relationships between citizens, and it's also the relationships that states have among themselves within the EU especially. And this horizontal dimension, I think, should be nuanced or corrected, because in those horizontal citizens between citizens, there are private economic powers that weigh a lot. And we talked about the social media, which are deadly distrust vectors, but there are economic powers behind them. So there's a huge work of regulation to be done, and that should be articulated with the compliance with the freedom of expression. Hence the difficulty. Fourth point, paradoxical concept. We said that 10, 20 times. Sorry, I will repeat it. But positive trust cannot be confused with what was called negative trust. I think Céline used that phrase. And negative trust is the blind trust. The French people who had a blind trust towards the Maréchal Pétain, for example, they got closer to the abyss. So we have to value a mix of trust and vigilance. Martin Laughlin said that distrust guarantees freedom. That's inherited from political liberalism, and there's a certain dose of distrust is to be had. So there is no healthy political and social life without this positive trust, but a paradoxical trust should have this combination of trust and distrust. And Céline and Elena were saying this in one of their interventions. Constitutional law should try to establish trust in relationships. That's not what analytical theory, I don't know what it might say about this, but I think that's quite relevant. Private joke, sorry. Now, I'm getting older, and I take some liberties with people who have a passion for analytical theory of law, and I don't like it, but sorry, I shouldn't have done it. That theory is useful, and we're counting on you to shed some light on this. Fifth point, a legal concept. I'm coming to it finally. This conference was initiated by legal experts who thought, well, trust, yes, well, we know it well. It's at the core it's the core of the parliament regime, but it's more than that. And I would like to thank them for embracing this concept to give it some meat. And of course, we agree trust cannot be decided, but there are some legal conditions that can either favor it or presume trust. So there are legal conditions that presume of trust. Cecilia Riscala and Patricia Poppelier, who repeated a bit what the other speaker said. Cecilia Riscala and Patricia Poppelier reminded us that the legal rule of mutual trust between the member states in the EU is fundamental. The EU cannot work without the compliance with this mutual respect principle. So this is something that is imposed, especially by the case law of the Court of Justice, and that can be reversed with restrictive conditions that we shouldn't push too far. If not, everything would collapse. So this is an example of legalization of this concept, and this is a concept that is a legal one. And of course, same thing for trust at the core of the parliamentary regime. We have ministers that are accountable towards the government, and there are some motions of confidence or votes of confidence or not, or no confidence. And of course, we heard some presentations this afternoon highlighting the large number of gray area that we have in this trust relationship within the parliament regime. So there are gray areas. And of course, when we extend the notion of political accountability by tackling it in a diachronic way and by looking towards the future to the question of our accountability, our responsibility towards future generations, as Céline did in the last presentation, then there's still a lot of work to be done in this field. And there's also some room for a legal approach that is about identifying legal conditions that could be formatted in favor on the establishment of trust relationships between the different actors that I have identified. So what are these conditions, legal conditions in favor of these relationships? I can identify 6. First, readability of the rules and documents. That's the big problem of the EU. I mentioned it yesterday. The EU has a readability deficit that is quite substantial and that is probably impossible to get rid of, maybe if we can improve things a bit. So this idea of readability is interesting because it was regularly compared to the rule of transparency. So the distinction that I made yesterday with Rosa Vallon, there is a utopia of transparency, an ideology of transparency, and there are reasonable usages of transparency, and these are the ones that we should favor. But transparency without readability is a mistake, and this is what Jean-François Kerléo said, and also yesterday Émilie Van Oot, who talked about transparency for the political parties' accounts. And of course, the notion of readability is key. If not, transparency is just an alibi. It's an alibi that can generate more distrust than anything else. Second, legal conditions that is in favor is the accountability beyond the checks and balances of the parliament regime. And there a whole series of procedures that have to be reviewed in terms of feasibility and legitimacy. That's the accountability, of course.
The third legal prerequisite, which might favor trust, is reactivity, responsiveness, with rules which have to do with participatory democracy. It is true that this might contribute to this level of responsiveness. Of course, if we have a mutual approach in terms of trust, we need to trust one another, to have mutual trust amongst one another, with a view to be able to use those procedures of participatory democracy in a positive way. The fourth element which has been mentioned on a regular basis is exemplarity. I did love the definition provided by Eric Buge. Exemplarity from a legal point of view is actually a set of rules, checks and controls and sanctions which might encourage decision makers to be virtuous, you know. It might seem quite anachronic, you know, but that's the kind of thing we need to bear in mind. There is also the issue of availability, emphasized by Lena yesterday. So exemplarity needs to be further developed, and we need to remain within a reasonable level. Too much transparency would kill a transparency, and we might also have perverse effect in case we would have too much focus or a greater focus on exemplarity. As mentioned by Jean-François Carléo, we have some shortages to overcome. And yesterday I pointed out a series of deficits regarding the guarantees of exemplarity and probity at the level of the European institutions. That's what I stated yesterday. The very soft reaction of the Parliament regarding the Qatar-gate was a vehicle of distrust and mistrust at the level of the public opinion. The next element, which is important with the view to establish trust, has to do with ethics. We are quite close to exemplarity and probity. But 𝐶𝐮𝐬 did insist yesterday upon the fact that those elements goes hand in hand with the separation of powers. And he recommended the Dutch example, i.e. this experts committee, and the conclusion of the experts could be shared and supported by the elected representatives, so that they would impose those rules and code of ethics to themselves. And the sixth element, which is favorable to trust, and last but not least, is the respect of the rule of law. Mrs. Barrakas and Frédéric Brown did emphasize those elements. And I must say that in terms of fundamental rights, we need to insist upon the fact that education might be key regarding fundamental rights. I don't know whether you have read, Frédéric, my article with Isabelle Haché in the Belgian magazine Droit Constitutionnel, which does advocate a kind of democratic ownership of fundamental rights, because more and more those jurisdictions should not be allowed to build fundamental rights without this notion of ownership at the level of the elected representatives. And this would avoid a loss in terms of legitimacy. And the rule of law, the respect of the rule of law and fundamental rights are an excellent vehicle for trust. But of course, if they are not properly understood, this might trigger off some distrust and mistrust. Well, I've really developed this fifth element related to the legal approach, but the next element, the sixth one, is related to kind of hierarchy in terms of standards. What about those rules of law? Should we refer to the constitutional conventions as mentioned by our British colleagues, or should we refer to doctrines as mentioned by Lord Norton, or should we refer to the regulations in place within the different assemblies, and this would refer to the code of ethics or potentially legislation? So we did raise a series of questions, and it might be interesting, I believe, to come back and to dig a bit more into these questions. And if you remember what Matthias and Julien told us, we need to further develop the grey areas or blind spots and articulate the collective and individual responsibilities, and how can we fill in the gap thanks to, for example, the Constitution. Well, these were my 6 items, and now I'm going to make the conclusion of the conclusion. And then you will have an opportunity to rest and relax. We still have a lot to do. And that's the conclusion of the best colloquiums, to know that you still have a lot on your plate and a lot to do. There is legitimacy, democracy, trust, and those elements are at the very heart of our concerns. And she referred to Ricoeur and Max Weber. She insisted upon the fact that it is important to believe in a kind of legitimacy of the public administration and public authorities. It will not be satisfactory for Céline because she is really keen on a more well-structured approach. But I think that it is at the end of the day an element or a component, an unavoidable component, on which do depend legitimacy and authority in democracy. Democracy and trust are not the same things. I would like to come back to David Easton. He does develop a theory of democracy which does bear with a certain level of apathy, i.e. a democracy which would be satisfied with a very high level of apathy amongst citizens. So we are not up to the level of expectation we might have if we refer to Ricoeur, because he does believe that it is important to have a maximum of citizens involved in decisions. We should not mix democracy and trust, but trust is a kind of unavoidable component on which authority, legitimacy and democracy are fully dependent. We need a conceptual approach, and we need some institutional imagination, I would say, with a view to determine what might happen in the future. And future generations would therefore have good reasons to trust us. And that's what Céline did. And from a political point of view, I would say that her commitment is really wonderful, and we need to congratulate her on that. I'm almost reaching the end of my career, as you know. And I must say that I do believe that the younger generation is really marvelous. We have people who have a fresh mind. They are very thorough in their approach, and I think that they deserve a round of applause for all that. Thank you.